The criminal devised the plot after being inspired by a Sherlock Holmes story. The bank robbery was one of equal parts criminal cunning, luck, and ineptitude. The police knew a robbery was actively taking place somewhere within 8 square miles and raced to catch the criminals red-handed. But ironically, the robbery was taking place in the very street where Sherlock Holmes lived. And as a parting gift, the gang even wrote on the vault wall, "Let's see how Sherlock Holmes solves this." This is a story of the Baker Street job. Hi, and welcome back to the Historical Crimes and Criminals podcast. I'm Steve, your host, and I'm sure the intro music caught a few people out, but it's a special episode. It's the 50th episode, and I just want to say a big thank you to everyone who's been listening. Thank you for the support, and it's been a pleasure to do these episodes, and I still have a huge list of episodes, all in various stages of compiling. It's a bit of a modern crime for this week, but I caveat this with the fact that it's also 50 years since this crime, and it involves my love of the Sherlock Holmes canon. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's initial introduction of Sherlock Holmes, A Study in Scarlet, was first published in Mrs. Beeton's Christmas album in 1887, to which Conan Doyle received £25 in exchange for all future rights. A second novel, The Sign of Four, was published in 1890, but it was only with the publication of the short stories in the Strand magazine from 1891 that he instantly became the legendary fictional detective he remains to this day, with sales of the Strand magazine soaring each time a new Holmes story featured. One of the first stories in the Strand was The Red-Headed League, published in 1891, and for many people, including me, it's their favourite Sherlock short story. The plot involves a pawnbroker who's tricked away from his shop while a tunnel is dug between the shop and a nearby bank. And of course, Holmes sees 10 steps ahead of everyone else in the story and catches the robbers red-handed. Like many, I've always been drawn to stories of ingenious bank robberies, and I don't think I've ever followed a newspaper story more closely than 2015 with the Hatton Garden job, which also has a link to today's story. In bank robbery films like Stanley Kubrick's The Killing, The Asphalt Jungle, and the French classic Rafifi should be on your must-see list if you enjoy today's story. By 1971, when our story takes place, tunnelling into a vault certainly wasn't a new crime, and indeed, in the 14th century England, we saw it happen metres away from present-day Houses of Parliament at Westminster Abbey. After the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey in the 13th century, it was used to house the crown jewels and other valuables in a vaulted chamber called the Pyx Chamber. Guarded by the ever-present Abbey monks and having multiple gates, it was considered impregnable. However, the unthinkable happened, and in 1303 the vault was tunnelled into. The robber chose not to steal the crown jewels, no doubt because of their high profile, but instead took other valuables. and by the time of the discovery, all of London was on high alert. And, like all good crime stories, it wasn't the robbery, but the disposing of the goods that led to the downfall. The trail led to various pawn shops and back to a merchant called Richard Podlicott. Arrested, Podlicott was discovered with over £2,000 worth of goods, or £1.5 million now. He admitted that between Christmas and Easter, he had tunnelled for 98 days and dug under the Abbey grounds. And from his confession, quote, 8 days before Christmas, I came there to break in with tools acquired for the job, namely 2 chisels, large and small, a knife, and some smaller iron engines. And I worked at night until a fortnight after Easter. On the night of Wednesday, the eve of St. Mark, I got into the treasury, stayed inside through St. Mark's Day, sorting out the things I wanted to carry off, and on the following night, I got out, leaving part of the treasure under a bush to recover it the next day. And the rest I carried off, getting away through a gate behind St. Margaret's Church. 48 monks who had been arrested after the robbery were released. Podlicott was sentenced to death in November 1305, and he was carted from the Tower of London in a wheelbarrow and hanged on the Abbot's Gallows in Tothill Lane. His body was said to have been flayed and his skin nailed to the door of Westminster Abbey as a warning to other criminals for centuries, and it made for a rather good story for visitors. However, in 2005, a study of the remaining skin showed the hide to be that of animal origin. Richard was also saved from another terrible fate, which would first be seen with the head of William Wallace 2 years later, who inaugurated the custom of sticking heads on a spike on London Bridge. Heads would be lightly boiled and dipped in tar before spiking. The crown jewels were subsequently housed in the Tower of London later in the 14th century, where they are to be found to this day. On Saturday, September the 11th, 1971, around 11 p.m, Robert Rowlands, living in his flat in Wimpole Street, decided to go to bed with an Ian Fleming novel and to listen to Radio Luxembourg. He switched on his top-of-the-line radio, which was still switched to the channel which picked up CB radio communications. Rowlands rather enjoyed eavesdroppings on people's on-air chatter. However, it wasn't CB chat that he found himself listening to, rather an act of robbery taking place, with the robbers talking to each other on walkie-talkies. Initially, he heard comments over the radio that made him think a local cigarette shop was being burgled. And at 11:30 p.m, he phoned the local police station. The police officer thought it was a prank call and dismissed Rowlands, saying that perhaps he should record a conversation if anything interesting was overheard. Rowlands actually took the advice on board, and he had a small cassette recorder that he used for learning Spanish. At around midnight, he recorded dialogue between the gang inside the shop and the nearby lookout about their need to take a break. First voice: Right, well, listen carefully. We want you to mind for 1 hour from now until approximately 1 o'clock, and then go off the air, get some sleep, and come back on the air with both radios at 6 o'clock in the morning. Second voice: I suggest we carry on tonight, mate, and get it done with. First voice: Look, the place is filling with fumes where we was cutting. And if the security come in, smell the fumes, we're all going to take Stopple and none of us have got nothing. Whereas this way, we have all got 300 grand to cut up when we come back in the morning. And if security have announced it for us, at least we've got something. The disagreement between the lookout and the gang continued for a while, and the lookout said, "Money might be your god, but it's not mine, and I'm fucking off." Eventually, after input, with a woman's voice and a fourth person who seemed to carry more sway than the others, the lookout agreed to remain on the roof overnight. The lookout man was also given an update on the progress they had made opening the safety deposit boxes. "We've done 90% of the easy ones, and now we face the hard ones." At 2 a.m, Rowlands decided he'd enough material recorded to call the police again, but this time he didn't call the local station, but phoned Scotland Yard directly. Scotland Yard sent members of the flying squad to listen to the tapes, and they confirmed that they thought a burglary was taking place. The officers stayed with Rowlands until 8:30 a.m. on Sunday the 12th of September, when the gang radioed the lookout. One of the gang members in the shop thanked them for staying on the roof all night and informed them that they planned to finish the job early that afternoon. Shortly afterwards, Rowlands and the listening policeman heard the final radio broadcast. "Would you like to change to the other channel? Over." Rowlands thinks this is a code for leaving the bank. Police started contacting bank staff and local security firms to open their branches as they began to check each of the 750 banks in an 8-mile radius. Each branch was visited by both bank staff and the police. They visited the Baker Street branch of the Lloyds at 3:30 p.m. on Sunday the 12th of September 1971. They found the vault secure and closed tightly, with a time-sensitive locking system that had not been tampered with, and they left with the assumption that all was well and moved on to the next bank. However, when on Monday the 13th of September, the bank manager did his rounds and opened the vault, what he found shook him to the core. The vault was in disarray, with over 260 security boxes opened, valuables littering the entire vault, and a hole in the vault floor. And scrawled on the wall of the vault were the immortal line, "Let's see how Sherlock Holmes solves this one." Plans for the robbery had commenced in 1970. Anthony Gavin was a 38-year-old photographer from Dalston. He was physically fit, being a former Army physical training instructor. He was purported to be a member of Brian Reader, who would go on to do the Hatton Garden Jobs gang. However, he was described as a low-level gang member who had a forceful personality and a propensity to be physically threatening. He was inspired by the Sherlock Holmes story, The Red-Headed League, and he decided to target the Lloyds Bank on Baker Street. To this end, he decided to plan and recruit. In December 1970, he recruited Reg Tucker, a second-hand car dealer from Islington. Tucker, who had no criminal record, opened an account at the bank with £500. In February 1971, he rented a safety deposit box at the bank, and over the following months, he would visit his box on 13 occasions. The bank's policy at the time was to leave customers in private while visiting the vault. Tucker used this time to measure and map the vault, using his umbrella and the floor tiles that were 23 centimetres squared. He drew a map of the room, plotting every aspect, and noted that from the first visit to the last, there had been no changes. The next recruit was Thomas Stevens, another car dealer with no criminal record. His role was to acquire tools for the job, including a 100-ton jack and a thermal lance. Mickey Gervais was a burglary alarm expert. Bobby Mills was to be a lookout man, and two other persons who were never identified, known only as TH and Little Legs. The gang got a break in May 1971 when 2 doors down from the bank, at a leather goods stores, the Saks, were selling their lease for £10,000. Gavin had been seeking such an opportunity, and an associate of the gang, 64-year-old Benjamin Wolfe, who already had a shop and was a seller of ornaments and knickknacks, purchased the lease, and the plan could be set in motion. When the plan was ready, the shopfront windows were whitewashed and a sign reading "Closed for refurbishment" was put up. The gang chose to tunnel under the vault because the walls and the ceiling were protected by vibration alarms, trembler switches that would sense unusual vibrations or shock waves and automatically trigger an alarm summoning police. But more luck was with the gang. Nearby ongoing roadworks meant the trembler alarms in the vault were switched off for periods after several false alarms, and the gang had contacts. A member of the local security company alerted the gang of the timing of the digging when the alarms were off. Work began on the tunnel on the Friday evening of the August bank holiday 1971 and then continued until 10th of September 1971. To avoid being overheard, they dug only during the weekends, and Gavin led the digging of the tunnel from Lussac to under the vault floor. He later said that he lost 2 stone, or 28 pounds, or 13 kg, in the process. The entry hole he, Tucker, and the third member created in Lussac was 15 inches or 38 centimetres wide and through 6 inches of concrete. Gavin dug until he reached the walls of Chicken Inn's basement. The gang then dug down and continued under the building, using the basement floor as the roof of their tunnel. The tunnel was 40 feet or 12 metres long when finished, and at the end, under the vault, the gang created a cavity 7 by 4 by 5 feet, or 2.1 by 1.2 by 1.5 metres. The digging created 8 tons of waste, which was simply hauled back into Lussac and dumped into the rear of the premises. The tunnel, which didn't need any supports, was later described in court as a magnificent piece of engineering. The gang began their entry into the vault on Friday the 10th of September, after the bank closed for the weekend. The gang placed a lookout man on a rooftop overlooking the bank and kept in touch using walkie-talkies. Their intention was to use the 100-ton jack to force a hole in the 3-foot-thick reinforced concrete floor, and railway sleepers were laid on the floor to support it. What they didn't know was that there was an old well under where the tunnel ended, and the pressure of the jack pushed the bottom of their tunnel down into the well rather than raising the vault's floor upwards. The gang then used a thermic lance in an attempt to cut through the floor. They, however, ran into a problem that they didn't foresee. The burn bar was taking far too long, and it created dense toxic fumes in a tunnel, which made it impossible for the robbers to finish the job. And then they decided to go old school. They drilled holes in the underside of the vault floor and packed them with gelignite. On Saturday, the gang coordinated the blast of the explosives with movement in the traffic in the area to mask the noise. And a 12-inch wide hole was blasted in the floor and into the vault. The tunnel was cleared of the debris, and the hole was widened with a hammer and chisel. By the time they had finished, the exit of the tunnel measured 12 by 14 inches, or 30 by 36 centimetres. On Monday the 13th of September, the bank manager of the Lloyds Bank was aware that the police had visited, but assumed all was well, and he wasn't prepared for the scene of devastation that awaited him. He immediately called the police. During the burglary, 268 safety deposit boxes had been opened, about a quarter of the boxes present. Police found the thermal lance, walkie-talkies, and other tools, including an oxyacetylene torch in the shop. 800 pieces of evidence were logged and forensically examined. The bank provided the police with the names of 260 box owners. 8 others refused to allow their names to be passed on. Estimates of the takings ranged from 150,000 to 4 million of goods missing. 4 million would be the equivalent of 40 million nowadays. Up to 120 detectives worked the case, organised into 4 teams, one examining the scene, one contacting the known safety box owners, one covering the coordination from the control centre, and one team dealing with all external inquiries. And that might have been the tail end of an incredible story of an ingenious robbery that would have remained unsolved to this day, except for perhaps one of the biggest pieces of stupidity in criminal history. Benjamin Wolfe, when signing the lease, had used his own name and details. After several weeks of surveillance and investigation, police had identified Wolfe, Gavin, Stevens, and Tucker as key individuals to arrest, but they also wanted to speak to 3 or 4 other people who they thought were involved. One of those they were interested in had been living in France and Italy since October 1971. There were no extradition agreements in place at this time. Towards the end of October 1971, police surveillance teams saw Tucker hand over a bag to 2 men, Abdullah Hashan Ganji and his nephew Akbar Muhammad Ali Ganji. The 2 were arrested and £32,000 of notes were seized. Wolfe, Gavin, Stevens and Tucker were also picked up within the next 2 days. During these arrests, police identified 231,000, which they identified as stolen from the vault. The trial of the 4 gang members and the 2 Ganges opened on the 2nd of January 1973. Stevens, Tucker, Wolfe and Gavin were charged with breaking into the bank, stealing the contents of the security boxes, and of possessing explosives. The 2 Ganges were charged with handling stolen goods. Stevens, Tucker and Gavin pleaded guilty. Wolfe and the 2 Ganges pleaded not guilty. The 2 Ganges stated they were acting as a courier for a Swiss-based finance house involved in purchasing sterling. Wolfe claimed that after he signed the lease for Lassac, he'd only returned to the shop once to pick up the post, and he was shocked to hear the news about the break-in. The trial ended on the 23rd of January 1973, and sentences were handed down 3 days later. The two Ganges were found not guilty. Stevens, Tucker, and Gavin each received sentences of 12 years. Wolfe received 8 years due to his age. The story after the robbery becomes a wee bit murkier. What was in the security boxes remains a matter of debate and conjecture. There has long remained a theory that one of the boxes contained compromising pictures of the Queen's sister, Princess Margaret, and her alleged lover, John Biden, London gangster and actor who had roles in such classic films as Get Carter, From Russia with Love, Quadrophenia, and Barry Lyndon. He certainly was a favourite with the princess, visited her on the Caribbean island of Mystique, and he liked to boast that he impressed her with his party trick of balancing 5 half-pint beer mugs on his manhood. It was rumoured that the pictures had been stashed away for leverage by well-known underworld figure Michael De Freitas, known as Michael X, a drug dealer and Black Power leader. It was suggested that with the loss of these pictures, he fled to Trinidad, where he was convicted of murder and hanged in Trinidad in 1975. The government file on him will remain closed until 2054. It was suggested that a D notice was applied 4 days after the robbery. It has always been denied, although the case certainly received less news coverage after this time. A D notice or defence notice can be applied to protect items of national security. A Daily Mirror article of 2008 eventually revealed that the Fleet Street editors of the day were approached directly by senior government officials and told to drop the story. Moreover, in the same article, one of the 4 unnamed convicted robbers stated about what they found in the deposit boxes. Quote, "And what was the most disturbing was the child pornography we found. We were so disgusted and left it there in their open boxes so that police could trace the owners." It's long been speculated that these pictures were of a Conservative cabinet minister, but this has always been denied by the government. Many of the papers relating to the burglary remain under embargo at the National Archives until January 2071. Here's hoping I can live as long as Prince Philip. Well, that's it for another episode of the Historical Crimes and Criminals podcast. I hope you enjoyed that one. If you did, please leave a review, subscribe, and until next time, bye-bye.